So my name is Anna. Yeah, second slide should be our pictures, but we can start. So my background is in statistics. I've done my academic training in statistics, and then for the past 10 years I've worked in different areas of bioinformatics between genomics and now with mass dynamics and proteomics. With a little gap working in consulting for the company ELISA, where I met some of the beautiful faces here.
Awesome. So my name's Aaron. I'm an engineer by trade for years. I started at a company, well soon, a year into my career, I started at a company called DS. You may have heard of them. And spent many years there and worked overseas, mostly as a contractor and a consultant. In the last 5 years, I've been working at Mass Dynamics, so I helped co-found Mass Dynamics. So I was the engineering co-founder. So with all that experience in the first 10 years, working with lots of different needs, with varying degrees of scale, lots of users, lots of data, all that kind of stuff. It's kind of well suited to help found this company. And yeah, part of the journey that I've had to go through from the start till now. So yeah, I'm pretty excited to share how that's going.
Thank you, Aaron. Can I just ask quickly, and this will be useful for the speaker after, can you just shout out some of your roles? I guess, it's mostly data science, software engineer, other things, artists. No. Can you tell me? Sorry? Project manager. Awesome. So there is no one from science. Just what I wanted to check. Oh, there's some from science. Yeah, there's some. Yeah. Of course, we are a startup, and we do software for scientists, so to make their life easier. So I'm going to introduce a bit what is mass dynamics and why we exist, and there will be a little bit of science intro as well. Because we are here on Tech Meetup, then I want to show you how actually mass dynamics looks and feels, meaning, when you look at the app, what are we talking about? And then Aaron will deep dive a little bit in the back scene to tell us how, what technologies we use in the back. And the core of the talk will be around 3 case studies, some of the challenges and the problems that we're trying to solve. And if we have time, we'll conclude with an open challenge. And if you have maybe suggestions as well. So, what is mass dynamics? It's a web and cloud-based platform to streamline the analysis of proteomics data. All right, so that's great. So I guess web and cloud makes sense. Analysis, streamline also makes sense, makes things easier. What is proteomics data and why actually we exist?
That's not the app, by the way.
All right, so if we take a step back, proteomics, you will hear the word proteins. We all love proteins. It's not just for muscles building, but it's really, proteins are part of the key component of any biological process that you can think of, really anything from I'm talking now, thinking, anything. And they are crucial elements for us to study to understand health and disease. And probably, if they are also the target of a lot of drugs, meaning that if you want to create a new drug treatment, and usually we don't want to just have one protein at a time. We might want to study large-scale proteins. So I might take a blood sample and I want to quantify and measure all the thousands of proteins in this sample. And this is what we call proteomics. So it's the large-scale study of proteins. Finally, how do we actually measure and identify these proteins? Still probably today the most used technique is called mass spectrometry, which is an analytical chemistry-based technique. And when I asked Dali to show me a mass spectrometer, beautiful, it's magical, there's tubes, there's a lot of complicated things. So you can already imagine, I've seen some, they look similar, not quite like this, but you can already imagine that it requires a lot of skills behind to actually know how to operate this and how to make sense of things. But to give you a more practical approach, so say that you are a scientist and you have a questions in mind. You want to measure you take blood samples from different people, and then you want to understand why by looking at the proteins, why some people respond versus people that don't. So you know what you want to do. You go and extract the samples, and then your next step will be to go to a mass spec lab over there where you bring your tube with your samples. The mass spec experts will then help you and will produce some data. And then after you've got your data, then depending on the scale of your project, you might need some software engineering to automate, streamline the workflow, and to pre-process your data. Because believe me, the data that come out of there is not quite straightforward as like a simple TSV notebook. And then of course you will need someone like me with some bioinformatics, some analytics expertise to actually understand what happens. And I put all these arrows because it's not that it's just a one flow. Often it's like, start with one, go to the other one, do some QC, go back and forth, send me some emails, lose some emails, and you know, this is kind of how the process works. And sometimes you might find the unicorn that knows how to do everything. It's quite rare, they do exist, but most often than not, all these components will work in making it really hard and losing track of sometimes of how things are actually tracking. So that's why we exist, to actually connect all the pieces of this puzzle. We don't produce the data ourselves, so we rely on, you know, we don't have any of that machines, any mass spectrometer. But the idea is that we want to then enable, once you have the data, enable any life scientist with no knowledge in bioinformatics, engineering, software engineering to actually access and obtain the results and the answers that they need. And so how does the app, you understand what I'm, you know, you visually understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to stop a second. We start with a black workspace, Canva, yeah, with a black sort of I said Canva, but I don't mean Canva, just like a black workspace. And the idea is that the workspace, basically, you know, you don't need to understand everything, but the idea is you can drag and drop. This is my experiment design with my tissue, liver, cerebellum, lung. I add another module which represents another analysis. I might add a visual plot, like plots. Don't worry about what they are, just like, this is kind of like the idea, but the idea is that I can drag and drop, select analysis modules as they are available, as we make them available. All the modules are interacting with each other. You can then select, you know, proteins of interest, make lists, use it in other module, create new tabs, delete and redo, take notes, and so on. So, does that give you the idea? Yep. So, I'm now going to hand over to Aaron.
I might jump over here so I can control things. So yeah, I'm going to talk mostly from an engineering perspective and also a bit of the journey we've had since we started the company. So not that quickly. Okay, so as you would have seen, what Anna just demoed was all happening in a web browser. The architecture is partly service-oriented and partly event-driven. And what you need to read from that is it's constantly evolving, and it's probably evolving from one of those to another one of those. This happens here, where a lot of the data off the mass spectrometer is processed off-platform, and usually results in a set of tabular data. We accept that tabular data into our system. We then process it, and then once it's processed, it's ready for analysis by the user. So the user is there analyzing it. And then this cycle starts where they'll look at the data and they might want to do more with it. So they'll create more analysis off of that data. And it's kind of an iterative process that happens there, right? And this happens over and over. In terms of the tools we're using, the web application is a fairly typical web stack. So it's just a three-tier stack. But not a lot of science is happening in there. It's more account management and rendering pages and stuff like that. We defer to a lot of other services to do the work, such as visualizations and managing the experiment data. In terms of processing, as you can imagine, some of this processing is usually in some kind of sequence, like a multi-step pipeline. And so we use a tool called Prefect to do that, and we wrap that in a service so that we can call that coherently. And that Prefect is that it's calling the R scripts and the Python scripts in a timely manner. And those scripts are producing data which gets stored into usually S3. From there, depending on the type of data, we'll have events like SQS and SNS events. that will pick those things up and put them into the right spots. So it's all running on EKS, almost, which is Kubernetes, by the way. Here we go. Ray knows what I'm talking about. We can talk on that slide for an hour. So that was just a quick intro into it from a tech perspective. But when we started the company, this is Giuseppe. He is one of the co-founders as well. He has he's, let's say, an expert or one of these analytical chemists. So I come from the commercial world, and I'm like, I know how to build these things at scale, and he's got these really clever scripts that do awesome things, but doesn't know how to scale them. So the process became basically, I'll take these scripts and I'll orchestrate them, and kind of bring that technical and engineering. But as we did that, we ran into some problems pretty early. Not that there were issues early, but as time went on and the company grew, they started becoming bigger issues for us. So for instance, I come from the world of web applications, right? So I'm dealing with objects like JSON objects, so things that I'm fairly fluent with. Tabular data, I knew what it was, but less so. So I go to Pepe, make me a JSON object, right? And he's like, okay. You know, and he's like, I think, okay, I'll just listen to whatever Aaron says, we'll do. And then there's visualizations as well, such as, you know, as you saw in the app, things are quite interactive, right? So you're like, well, I know how to write JavaScript, let's build it all in the app. But the problem there is obvious. The engineers are building the visualizations, not the scientists. And over time, that became problematic, particularly when you think about bug fixes and updates and scaling and all that kind of stuff. And then there's obviously the data itself, right? Like we talk about protein data and peptide data and intensities data. You know, when a scientist looks at these tables, they have meaning, you know, with columns with types that need to be stored, right? So there was a lot of naivety when we started the company, and as we went on, we realized that we had to develop this like appreciation for each other's worlds. And to further emphasize that, you know, when you're an engineer and you're writing code, usually you're doing quality code through unit tests and lots of them, right? And you know, you're usually starting with blank tests if you're TDDing or however, whatever approach you take, and you're, you know, committing them to Git, and there's this CI/CD pipeline that's going to take it all. That all happens in like 20 minutes, right? So when an engineer picks up some work to do, it's fairly quick, right? And if there's anything to learn, usually it's learned on the job, right? You're a couple of Stack Overflows away from figuring out how to do it, or I guess ChatGPTs these days. And sometimes you need a spike ahead of time, obviously, but it's mostly iterative. And in this world, you know, our engineers are mostly coming from the commercial world. They don't have a science background, right? And they don't have time to go get a PhD, right? So they're learning science on the job. Whereas the scientist has a very, very different approach to this. You know, a lot of data is usually visual and somewhat manual, right? And there's benchmarking data to assert against to make sure that you're making the right decisions. And usually, you know, you're starting with a Jupyter notebook because the data is usually pretty big, and that's probably running on an EC2 machine somewhere, not your IDE on your laptop. And there's a lot of upfront research and development that has to happen in order to make the right decisions, because you can't half-bake science and put it out there and then render a graph wrong, right? Like, it needs to be correct from the start. So there's a lot more upfront work that needs to happen. Finally, you know, this is more about the team stuff, but like with engineers, you know, you can feel it's, you know, there's a lot of overlap in the skills, I guess. If you're a web developer and you've done back-end stuff, you know, there's a lot of overlap there, and you can interchange into roles, whereas science is a lot of specializations in like biology or statistics or mass spec. So these are the challenges that we kind of like face. And, you know, to solve this, you know, requires pretty deep collaboration in the team. Okay, so as mentioned, we're going to, which, you know, there's probably dozens of case studies, but these are three that seemed obvious to talk about. And they're basically going to be journeys that we had taken from some idea or some solution that we had into a better solution. So the three areas are building data visualizations, as I mentioned, that were happening in the browser. They don't anymore. Quality science code to production, and then data structures in general. So I'll talk about the first one, and then Anna will talk about the middle one, and then I'll come back. Okay, so this is a bit of a snapshot again. You saw the video, like lots of visualizations, right? This is how scientists interact with the data. So as mentioned, these visualizations are built in the app, right? And that means they're controlled by the engineers. And to build the visualizations, you need the data to build the visualizations. So you needed that as well, right? And then there's testing of that code that has to happen there too. And as we said, engineers are prone to doing things with unit tests, whereas visualizations are quite visual. And through that process, the scientists supervise, right? It's like, so to give you an example, I would build a visualization in the app, and Giuseppe would build it offline, and I would do a comparison, naive comparison of the two, and go, does it look like that? And if it looks like that, then we did a good job, and then I would put all the automation testing over it. That was all good at the start, but it becomes pretty problematic very quickly. So with a large amount of data, for example, so some of these visualizations, that will require tens of megabytes sometimes of tabular data, right, already filtered. And query that is actually really problematic. It's good with objects and structures, but flat tables, not so much. And obviously with bug fixes or any updates we wanted to make to those visualizations, it was all engineering work, right? The scientists would say, we need that to happen, and the engineer would have to do it. So scientists didn't have the autonomy to be able to make the updates that they needed. So we solved the problem in this, well, I think, a clever way. So we've built this thing called a visualization engine internally, but it's a Python-based, like HTTP service. It's co-owned by the engineers and the scientists. So the engineers built the API and all the pipes into the data, and the scientists build the visualizations, right? So we store data in a whole host of things. Here's a couple of them. And we've built objects to represent those data stores to make it easier for the scientists to pull data from the system. And they'll build those visualizations, usually in Plotly, in the Viz service. And the web application would obviously make a request to the Viz service to say, here's visualization, and you would provide it. So the clever thing that's happening here is, as I mentioned earlier, the interactivity in the app is really important to us. So when you select a scatter plot, for example, you want something in the menu bar to trigger. So in order for that to happen, the developers need to have some control in the web app in order to make that whole experience sing the way that we wanted. So the way we got around that was, with Plotly, there's a JavaScript library for it, but there's also a Python library for it. So we built the Plotly objects, and then we requested them from the client, and using Plotly in JavaScript, we just rendered them. So we've got these visualization components that are fairly generic in the app, which are just taking these Plotly objects and rendering them. And because it's doing the rendering, it can hook into all the events for selections and all those things as well. So it's like a huge win-win for us. And the web app is kind of dumbed down a little bit. It doesn't have that science. It's a little less. It has less depth of the science, right? It's like, yeah, it's rendering a science visualization, but it doesn't really know anything about that. I should mention these case studies. They're varying degrees of complete. So some of these, this service has been around for a while, so all our new stuff is there, but we still have old things done the old way, right? So as most systems are, they're constantly evolving. But this idea is pretty solid, and how we're going to continue doing it. So that's the first case study.
How are we tracking with time? Yeah. Okay, we don't have to do this. But basically, so now Aaron has said how, as a scientist, I can quickly create a new visualizations. I can now put new things in the app. Well, it's not quite as quick, but it became really quicker for us to build new features. However, as a scientist, and I speak for myself, I'm sure that I speak for myself. I know that there's different types of scientists out there, but growing up as a scientist, I didn't really grow up my upskilling that I needed to write tests for every, script that I was writing to do an analysis. I didn't have to automate things. I didn't have to push code. Very different worlds. Whereas the engineers, for them, it was very, very, very different. And of course, the impact is that we don't want to put wrong data in front of the user because they want to actually have something right. And the other thing is that we don't want to slow down the releases by, checking 1,000 times the same thing. So I might be preaching to the converters as well, but what we decided is that to support and to make it easier for all the scientists as well, like for me to basically transfer the accountability to push the code to production. Say our functionality in the app is behind the pipeline, so an automated pipeline. We use BuildKite in this case, but there's plenty of tools out there. This allows us to have automated auditing, testing, and to make sure that really the engineers don't have to come in and help every time I want to release something, and I have to put in place all of that. And it's quite easy for me to put in place all of that by myself, most of it. This is for the second one, and
I'll be quick. So yeah, as mentioned in the early days, we're controlling the data storage, so mostly being ingested or imported to some other store out from S3. But that became problematic because scientists couldn't get to that data easily enough. So when there's a production issue, for instance, and this thing's not working, it's very hard. It was harder for the scientists to get to it. So we had to let me see if there's anything worth. Yeah, there were some issues there. As mentioned, like when we're translating that data, even if it's table data into a table data store, there's still types and all these things to think about. To the details of the actual data. So when data migrations need to happen, which might seem obvious from a science perspective because it's a natural thing, engineers are not privy to that because they haven't got that appreciation or expertise in that area. So we solved it by, S3 was a good place for the data to live, and so that really didn't change, but what we've done is we've kind of augmented what gets stored in S3 a little bit, because obviously for the app's perspective, we need to be able to query data in a reasonable amount of time. So if you've got a TS, to query that, you need to download the whole thing and then query it, right? So there's other storage mechanisms now, such as Parquet, that make that a lot easier. So this works really well for us, and again, this is probably a bit in the earlier stage, so we're still proving it out completely, but it's working so far. So when data is processed, it's the scientists who write the processing code are producing the tables that get stored into S3. So they know what the columns are, they know what the tables are, right? And there can be many tables stored, obviously. And then when the visualization engine goes to get that data, again, the scientists built the visualization saved, right? So the engineers don't ever have to really crack open the files at all and look at them. They just need to be able to facilitate and marshal that data around the system so that the scientists can get to the data that they created. So this is great, again, because it frees the scientists up from the engineers having to own that process. They can just get to the data as easily as we can.
Maybe we can just go to the summary. I don't think. Yeah.
All right. We'll skip that. We'll skip. We can talk about that later. Can you hear about that? But do you want to do the summary?
Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. So I hope that we share with you our journey. So what we try to share with you tonight is that how we adapted our journey in order to adapt a set of technologies and methods that we use as we learn more about each other as engineers and scientists and designers as well. We haven't mentioned tonight, but they are a very important component as well. And I hope that with the 3 case studies, we gave you a little bit of an idea about how we basically mostly made it easier for scientists to be more responsibility of owning the scientific code and free up the engineers, and as well as making it more accurate and make it more safe for us to deploy to production. So anything to add, Aaron?
We're good.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Any questions?
You were talking about the scientists reviewing these visualizations. What does that look like? Is it like a giant table and everyone's going through the different visualizations? when it comes to what I understand, as I'm a software engineer,
Yeah.
I can very easily just, like you said, write a unit test or even capture an image and store that image somewhere and someone can look at it.
Yeah.
What did that look like?
So when you say what did that look like, what do you mean?
As in the QA process with the scientists.
Oh, so when they build the visualization, yeah, what does that look like? Yeah. So when they build a visualization, there's dev tooling that we didn't really address. So we've got a side app in the Viz engine that allows them to not have the visualization, right? So there's quality control happening in the Viz service as well, but it's probably happening more at like an acceptance level kind of area. But it's kind of owned by the scientists. So there's a bit of responsibility on the engineers to kind of make sure that that's happening and upskilling, and doing the automation and stuff like that, because these are builds that can take a long time, depending on how you write the tests. So there's still some automation happening there. But it's, the old world was like these visualizations would get built and then they had to be re-implemented by the engineer. So avoiding that.
I've got a question.
Yeah, sure.
I'm actually, one of my next big tasks is to build something really similar. So if you had your time again, so I'm taking scientific data that's in tabular format usually, and I need to build a visualization platform for people around the world, what would be the thing that you would have gone back to and told yourself at the start?
Oh my God. So many things. I think like the mindset at the start was, I don't know what's coming, so I have to stay light on my toes. The development very early on that way, and there's a lot of micro adjustments that happen in the platform very early, but that can only take you so far. You just kind of have to accept that the longer it goes, the more data you have, the harder it is, right? It's just kind of like how it is. So yeah, I could say that now. In 5 years again, it'll be a completely different answers, I think. Also, to be fair, like the problems we were solving at the start are very different to the ones we're solving today, and this is the nature of a startup. You're finding your way, and there's all these pivots you're making as a business. The product looks nothing like we. So, what's hidden underneath all of this is old ideas that still live there, to solve a different problem, and we're still unwinding a lot of that. So, yeah, it's like impossible to predict. Yeah.
How have you found the entry to a market when you go into hardcore science, the stuff you guys are in? What does it look like? What's the pushback from the market? I can imagine it's a very sort of stoic place, known and long existing procedures of how you process that kind of data.
Yeah, totally.
What did it look like when you first started entering and maybe now? What is it?
Yeah, when we first started, it was very much doing things at big scale. So we were originally taking the raw data off mass spectrometer. So now we accept the process data from a mass spectrometer. So that processing is happening off platform now. But we used to accept that data, and there's a lot of processing that happens there by us. And when we're making decisions in processing data, we have to be transparent and open about what's happening there, which was kind of counter to how we were building the system, which was just give us your data, it's a big black box, you don't have to do any of that overhead anymore. So we were solving pretty serious problems. Teams would take up to 2 weeks to process this data, and we would do it automatically in hours, right? And a lot of that's overhead, and not having to, it breaks overnight and you have to click the button again the next day. There's a lot of overhead there. But that ultimately, partly you have to have that code open source for sure, right? So the scientific parts, they need to do it by the scientists, what is actually happening under the hood. Because ultimately the data that's being produced is probably going into a paper or something, and they have to, they got to stand on both feet and say, this is correct, right? So in order to do that, they need to understand the tools and all the parameters and everything. So it's complicated. But in terms of this stuff, our platform is, it's becoming less and less over time, but it's quite unique. It's an environment dominated by desktop software and licensing, right? So you go into a big pharma company, for example, and they've got their giant Windows VM with one license running this really serious kit, and you can't log into it until someone else logs out, and we're just like, this is just for engineering or people coming from my world, it's like pretty rudimentary. Just put in a web browser, have multi-tenant, all that stuff. And that might seem obvious, but that was really unique in our market, and that kind of was, they're just used to long procurements, installs, all that kind of stuff to challenge. We're definitely trying to like push the technology, and it's not just us. There's obviously lots of competitors. It's getting more crowded, but yeah. You can ask questions after if we're running.
You can catch up afterwards.
Yeah, we'll be around. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Anna and Aaron. Thank you.